Great, thanks. Steve, I know this idea of learning networks is a central one to your ideas about the Stamford Innovation Center. I wondered if you could pull that thread out a little.
Sure. So, kind of building on the creative ecology, what we're proposing is not really just to be another pool of capital, developing some themes and going out and deploying capital in individual companies. We want to do that. We think that's an important part of the idea. But we're equally interested in providing a center of gravity to this early stage environment that fosters the collaboration and diversity and sharing. And we think that's something that is perhaps lacking in the market today here. We see Bill Gordon, who's out there, I think behind table 7. Bill and I have been kicking this idea around for a little while, and Johan Wong, who's also over here, has been doing some similar work here in Stamford. And so there are groups of people seeing the same opportunity and same need for a networking hub, a place where you can have events and begin to build a dynamic of people. We also have relationships into some activities that are going on in other parts of the country. So we're friends with an incubator in Washington called Launchbox, and one in Boulder called Techstars, and a couple in Europe, one in Sweden and one in the Czech Republic, and there's probably a lot more. And so we start to see nodes around the world that we want to wire together, I guess, in a sense, and leverage off of their expertise. We see sort of a series of visiting profs. We have a couple of them with us today, but as some of these folks cycle through, we would envision creating events to bring people together and hear how innovation is happening in other parts of the world. And over time, we'd like to be a thought leader and maybe even a content creator in this area. And we think we have a great venue with the Old Town Hall. So we believe that the social and collaborative fabric that we can be part of building is as much a design point as a nice portfolio of incubated companies.
Great, and Laz, I know you are starting to do some work in linking communities like Stamford that are trying to reinvent themselves together in a learning network where they can learn from each other, perhaps complement each other explicitly. I'm going to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I think if we actually made the statement right up front that the new organisational unit, most probably always has been the organisational unit in reality, is networks. And when you say network, think systems. When you say systems, think ecology. These things are very dynamic, very, very unstable at times, and sometimes they do exhibit stability. But that's what you're dealing with here. So when picking up on Steve talking about creating a network of entrepreneurs, that network wants to do specific things. And I keep on saying the mantra. It has to understand as a network the conditions and put the capabilities together, because they're network functions. You know, a team as a team, a football team as a team understands the conditions on the day and the capabilities to play the game to produce the value. That's how they do it. So those three things become important in terms of conditions lining up with capabilities, lining up with action in any one network. And that's a pretty simple strategic process to think about. What we want to do is not necessarily tell you what to do in Stamford, because as Steve has pointed out, the entrepreneurial outburst that will happen here, the unleashing of that creativity, is going to produce all sorts of things very specific to the capabilities and the conditions that impact Stamford. And the actions will take place will be very Stamford specific. But what's happening up in, say, Rhode Island, where we've spent 3 years doing similar work up there, all under this banner of resilience, to get these three things aligned, to be ahead of the conditions, is doing something similar that's Rhode Island. Different to down here, but actually complementary in the greater region. So all of a sudden you start to see the scaling of this local community to something that's a bit bigger, to maybe going up to Boston. Now imagine if we had all of those particular people talking a similar language. Now imagine if there was a guy up in Boston that understood a condition that we didn't understand down here, but he knew someone down here and was connected in to actually explain that condition. You know, and you've already heard this is what you're doing already in terms of those other places in Zurich or wherever you're doing it. But this doesn't happen at the community level. Communities tend to be very myopic. They tend to stick all around their own little bunch. They don't understand what's going on in the world. And I think that's a disaster waiting to happen. If you don't understand the conditions, how do you know to get the capabilities right in that community? So we need to link these communities up and not only take it at the scale of the northeast corridor of the US. We've got a similar thing happening in Victoria, in Australia, and in Western Australia. And the idea is to possibly do one in Europe and somewhere else. Being able to use communication and sharing and all those sorts of things is to share conditions, share capabilities, to actually look at resilience at its real level. Because Stamford cannot be resilient by itself. It cannot be sustainable by itself. Now, these problems are global problems. If you do not solve these problems at the global and the local level, you're not going to solve the problem, you're not going to realise the opportunity. So that's the premise here that we're talking about. It's the possibility of a resilient region.
And I'll put an offer on the table for those who are interested in one or both of two things to join us next Monday at 3 at the URC offices, where we'll pursue them in a little more depth while Larry is still here. And that is this idea that we've been working through for the last 9 months of trying to understand emerging conditions. It's not something that you do and finish, okay, we're done with that, now we go on. Conditions are so dynamic and uncertain and constantly changing at an exponentially accelerating rate that you have to always be paying attention to emerging conditions. And I think there's some opportunities to create a structure around that without overdoing it. And the metaphor that stuck in my mind, because I was in Rhode Island for a while and working with the guys at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, the way our ballistic submarines listen for the Soviet subs, which they still do, is they have about a 2-mile long array of transponders. And the combination in this gigantic array creates a capability, an acoustic capability that's greater than the sum of the parts and enables them to listen for the faint cavitations of a distant Soviet sub. So using that metaphor, could we create a network of listening posts? People who during their normal day job are following trends, link them together, and in that combined array, hear the faint cavitations of emerging conditions. That's the notion. And what scale do you build that at? Do you build it at the Stamford scale, or is it something that's better to build at, say, a Northeast scale where you have a much richer, deeper set of listening posts? So we want to pursue that. We think part of the trick there is to provide the information you collect back to the people that you collect it from in an added value way that kind of distills it, visualizes it in close to real time, so they keep giving you information. And we know that there's technology in Western Australia to help do that. So it's an interesting project. If you're interested in that, join us. If you're interested in being an ambassador for Reinventing Stamford to Bridgeport, New Haven, New London, Providence, Boston, New York, join us for that, because we need help doing that. And it's my thought that we want to create a network of all the cities along the coast that are particularly impacted by rising sea levels as an emerging condition, and who are all arrayed along this road and rail corridor that's 95 in the Northeast Rail Corridor, and we can make something out of that. So if you have an interest in that specific opportunity, join us 3 o'clock, Monday the 14th, at the URC offices. Just one last point that I want to put on the table before we take questions, and if each of you could just give me, 1 or 2 minutes max, your thoughts on what I would call the trap of intentionality. John, you want to start?
In 1 or 2 minutes? Is that your intention?
Yes.
Okay.